Hello, esteemed viewers of the Whisper of History channel. Pause for a moment and look at the world around you. The crowded streets, the functional systems, your plans for the future. Now close your eyes and conjure a scene in your mind. The sky is a gloomy leaden color. The streets are empty, with only the whispers of fear suspended in the air. Every new day is worse than the last. The sudden appearance of purple spots at your door, followed by terrifying fever. A period when your breath was taken away, when hope died, when civilization fragmented. This is not the story of an ordinary disease. This is the tale of the greatest catastrophe in human history, a shadow that wiped out a third of the population, fundamentally shaking faith, science, art, and the social structure. The name of this shadow: the Black Death. How did a single bacterium manage to bring a continent to its knees? How did people fight this invisible enemy? And most importantly, what lessons did this deadly whisper leave for our modern world? Be ready. Today we embark on a journey into the darkest page of time, to the heart of the 14th century. The whispers you will hear tell not only of death, but also of survival and the resilience of the human spirit. What you will see in this video. In this epic three-part journey, we will explore the following. Part 1. The Birth and Journey of Death, 1347-1350. How the plague reached the heart of Europe from the steppes of Asia, who the first victims were, and how societies dissolved during the initial years of the epidemic. How fear and superstition spread faster than true science. Part 2. Societal Collapse and Dark Reflections. The devastating effects of the epidemic on social classes, beliefs, and art. The helplessness of doctors, the search for scapegoats, especially the massacres of Jews, and the radical cultural changes caused by the plague. Part 3. A New World Risen from the Ashes. The period after the plague's end. How the labor shortage increased the power of peasants, accelerated the decline of feudalism, and how Europe was reshaped on the road to the Renaissance. Now sit back and tightly close your doors. We are beginning. Welcome to the Whisper of History. Are you ready to unlock the greatest mysteries and legends of history with a whisper from the depths of time? Part 1. The Birth and Journey of Death, 1347-1350. The Geography of Calamity. Yersinia Pestis. Our story does not begin in the opulent medieval courts of Europe, but much further east, in the heart of Asia. In the early 14th century, the vast trade routes of the Mongol Empire, the Silk Road, were carrying more than just spices and silk. They were also carrying the deadliest biological weapon in history, the technical name of the calamity: Yersinia Pestis. This was a bacterium that multiplied in the guts of fleas that lived on rats. When the rats died, the hungry fleas sought a new host, and that new host, tragically, became humankind. Once the bacterium entered the human bloodstream, it opened the door to death. In its most common form, the plague manifested as the bubonic plague, causing the lymph nodes to swell, darken, and inflict horrifying pain. The bruised, swollen lymph nodes, or buboes, were the most prominent signature of those who died from the plague. A dark cargo on the Silk Road. It is thought that the plague remained confined to local epidemics in Asia for thousands of years. However, the expansion of the Mongol conquests and the global trade networks provided the bacterium with a perfect superhighway to spread. Merchant ships, caravans, convoys, these were mobile vehicles of death, carrying not only luxury goods but also infected rats. One of the most famous and chilling stories is told during the siege of the Genoese trading colony of Kaffa, modern Feudossia, in Crimea in 1347. As the Mongol army was being ravaged by the plague, it is said that the commander, Jani Beg, resorted to a tactic of desperation and horror, catapulting the corpses of soldiers who died from the plague over the city walls. This is widely considered one of the first recorded acts of biological warfare in history. The Genoese merchants in Kaffa, fleeing the terrifying situation, boarded their ships. These ships carried the seeds of the plague with them as they sailed into the Mediterranean, and so the ships of death set sail toward the southern ports of Europe. At the gates of Europe, Messina and beyond, in the autumn of 1347, a few Genoese ships docking at the port of Messina in Sicily sealed the fate of the European continent. The sailors on board were either dead or writhing in agony with horrifying buboes. Although the people of Messina tried quickly to drive the ships away from the city, it was already too late. The rats and fleas had come ashore. Starting from Messina, the plague spread with incredible speed across the Italian peninsula. Trade routes and densely populated cities became the bacterium's greatest allies. By 1348, Genoa, Venice, Pisa, Florence, Italy's greatest commercial centers, fell to their knees. It is estimated that more than half of Florence's population died. The famous writer Boccaccio immortalized those terrifying days in his renowned work, The Decameron. In a short time, Marseille in France, Barcelona in Spain, London in England, nowhere was safe. The disease engulfed all of Western Europe like a flame within a year. The Black Death recognized no geographical boundary, social class, or age. Bishops, kings, peasants, merchants, all knelt before the equality of death. Fear spread faster than the plague, driving people either to despair or to brutality. Society undone, panic and chaos. This first wave of the epidemic shattered the social order. Survivors either tried to flee or completely isolated themselves. The level of medical knowledge was far from understanding the true cause of the plague. The common belief at the time was that the disease was caused by miasma, bad smells, or the alignment of the planets. This ignorance deepened the desperation. Doctors, known as plague doctors, tried to treat patients by wearing long-beaked, strange masks. The tips of these masks were filled with sweet-smelling herbs and spices, which were believed to ward off the bad odor of the disease. However, these efforts remained merely symbolic. The disease progressed so quickly that many patients died within 48 hours of the first symptoms. Funeral rites ceased, and the dead were hastily thrown into pits. Neighborhood bonds and family affection all melted away before fear. Personal commentary on Part 1. While preparing this first section and reading about the despair of that era, one question always comes to my mind. How long can civilization stand when humanity encounters such rapid and brutal destruction? The first wave of the Black Death showed us the darkest face of human nature: chaos, selfishness, panic. But there are also stories of doctors and priests who risked their lives to help their neighbors. This tragedy was, in a sense, the first test of the human spirit's resilience. Part 2. Societal Collapse and Dark Reflections. The Trial of Faith and Science. The Black Death defeated not only bodies, but also the fundamental pillars of the era: faith and authority. The Church had preached God's power and mercy for centuries. Yet when the plague arrived, prayers did not work. Priests, bishops, and even the Pope himself could contract the plague and die. People were terrified. Was this the wrath of God? Or even worse, had God abandoned them? These questions fundamentally shook the medieval system of belief. The Church's power began to be questioned. While some surviving clergy members fled and abandoned their duties, thousands of others died at their posts to give the deceased their final send-off. The search for scapegoats, the Jewish massacres. Panic and desperation always kill logic. When the cause of the plague was unknown, people began to search for a scapegoat. Centuries of existing prejudice and hostility in medieval Europe became the target of this desperation. The Jews. A rumor spread rapidly. Jews are poisoning the wells to kill Christians. This claim was distorted by the fact that the plague appeared to be less severe in some Jewish ghettos, likely due to stricter hygiene rules or social isolation. In many cities across Europe, this irrational accusation triggered horrific massacres. Hundreds of Jewish communities in France and Germany were brutally murdered by angry mobs, despite the protection of plague doctors and local authorities. These tragic events constitute one of the most shameful pages of history and show us how deadly prejudice and ignorance can be during times of crisis. The dance of death in art, Danse Macabre? The cultural and artistic impact of the plague was immense. Death was no longer a distant concept, but a constant companion that could be by your side at any moment. This new awareness led to the theme of the Dance of Death, Danse Macabre, in art and literature. Artwork depicted a skeletal figure of death summoning everyone, from king to peasant, from pope to beggar, to join the dance. This theme emphasized the idea that death equalized everyone, the notion that life was short and meaningless and that worldly wealth held no value became prevalent. In literature, works like Boccaccio's Decameron captured the humor and drama of human nature, even under the shadow of the plague. Art essentially became a form of social therapy, an arena where the survivors processed their trauma. Economic disaster, famine, and the labor shock. In the short term, the plague paralyzed the European economy. Merchants abandoned their businesses. Fields were left unplanted. Workshops closed down. However, in the long term, the most radical effect of the plague occurred in the labor market. The death of a third, and in some regions half of the population, suddenly created a severe labor shortage. This was an unexpected revolution for the peasant class, who had been oppressed for centuries. Feudal lords struggled to find workers to cultivate their fields. This situation strengthened the hand of the surviving peasants. They could now demand higher wages and better working conditions. This surge in the demands of the working class led to a rapid increase in wages and undermined the traditional feudal hierarchy. Although governments attempted to halt the wage increases with legislation, such as the Statute of Laborers in England, these efforts failed in the face of economic reality. This shock was the single biggest factor that caused the centuries-old feudal order to crack. Personal commentary on Part 2. The Black Death was not merely an epidemic, but a profound social and psychological upheaval. While people showed their darkest sides in the shadow of fear, as seen in the Jewish massacres, the oppressed classes, on the other hand, gained power in the void created by death and sought justice. The plague was a force of both destruction and a rebellion that shook obsolete systems. This dark period laid the groundwork for certain steps forward in history. So, what kind of world emerged after all this chaos? We will focus on that in the third part. Part 3. A New World Risen from the Ashes. The end of feudalism and the reshaping of the class structure. The Black Death's most lasting legacy is the transformation it wrought in the social and economic structure of Europe. By the mid-14th century, when the first great wave of the plague ended, the population of Europe had been approximately 75 million. A few years later, that number was drastically reduced. This massive demographic shock completely disrupted the balance that had sustained the feudal system. As we discussed earlier, the labor shortage exponentially increased the economic value of the surviving peasants and workers. Practices of forced labor, serfdom, suddenly became unsustainable. Peasants could now abandon their lands, migrate to cities, or negotiate better agreements with their feudal lords. This situation accelerated the transition from an agricultural economy to a more flexible money economy. Landowners began to rent out their land instead of depending on coerced labor. This gave rise to a new class of free peasants and laid the groundwork for the emergence of a middle class, the bourgeoisie, that would modernize in later years. The Black Death was one of the greatest catalysts that hastened the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era. A new approach to education and science. The plague painfully exposed the ignorance in the field of medicine. The church and doctors were unable to stop the disease. This failure reduced trust in traditional authority and paved the way for new ways of thinking. The surge in deaths, particularly among university teachers and clergy, created a void in universities. A new generation of scientists and intellectuals found a chance to rise faster to fill this gap. More importantly, the trauma caused by the plague led people to step outside traditional molds and examine nature more closely. This period encouraged thought based on individual experience and observation. This way of thinking laid the foundations of the humanist movement, which would later prepare the ground for the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. People began to place greater value on earthly life and the importance of avoiding suffering in this life. The transformation of cities and the recovery of trade. The epidemic hit densely populated cities particularly hard. However, this loss spurred important lessons regarding urban planning and hygiene standards. As cities were slowly rebuilt, greater emphasis was placed on wider streets, better sewage systems, and public sanitation. These transformations helped mitigate the impact of future epidemics. In the long term, trade revived. Survivors inherited the goods and money of the deceased. This led to a redistribution of capital among people who previously had no chance to accumulate wealth and fostered the emergence of new commercial ventures. Europe was evolving toward an economic structure that was more dynamic, more flexible, and more innovative than it had been before the plague. The return of the plague and lasting scars. Although the Black Death lost its initial terrifying power after 1353, it did not disappear entirely. Europe continued to contend with recurring epidemics, second and third waves, that returned at regular intervals until the 17th century. Although each return was less devastating than the last, they created a constant fear of death and social uncertainty. However, each wave of the epidemic pushed people to become more resilient, adopt better medical measures, and be more organized. Quarantine practices, isolation hospitals, and epidemic control laws slowly developed. The Black Death, though at a painful cost, taught humanity how to organize against an invisible enemy. Personal commentary on Part 3. This section always makes me think. The greatest destructions also carry the seeds of the greatest changes. The Black Death was a horrific catastrophe that brought a civilization to its knees, yet it was also a cruel surgical knife that closed the somber curtain of the Middle Ages and opened the light of the Renaissance. The death of millions elevated the status of the survivors, demolished the fortress of feudalism, and increased the value of the individual. This new world, rising from the ashes, was more equal, more questioning, and most importantly, more humanist. The plague showed us that historical disasters are not solely about loss. They are also an irreversible engine of progress. Final summary. Esteemed viewers of the Whisper of History, across these 3 parts, we have examined the dark shadow of the 14th century, the Black Death, and how this horror fundamentally changed Europe. A single bacterium did not just take human lives, it also weakened the power of kings, bishops, and lords. It shook beliefs, brought a new theme of death to art, and ultimately, by increasing the bargaining power of the peasants, opened the doors to the modern world. The whispers of the Black Death still echo today. They remind us how connected our planet is, and how even the smallest organism can threaten the greatest civilization. They show us how deadly racism can be when combined with panic in times of crisis. But most importantly, they whisper to us about the resilience of the human spirit and our capacity to always build a better future, even after the greatest losses. Don't forget to subscribe and like to continue listening to the Whispers of History. See you in the next story. Forgotten stories always whisper.